Welcome to the complete guide to Google Analytics 4. This video will summarize Chapter 2, How does GA4 differ from prior versions, which was written by Search Discovery's own Elizabeth Brady. Now, Elizabeth started her career in analytics as an e-commerce analyst at Monster.com before branching out as an independent consultant in 2010, focusing on Google Tag Manager and Google Analytics. So, Elizabeth, welcome.
Thank you.
Now, first of all, first question I've got for you. This topic, as you know, could be huge. There are a lot of differences between GA4 and prior versions. Some of my clients feel like the learning curve is very steep to GA4 because it's so different. Coincidentally, that's how I got this black eye. I was in a disagreement about that very topic. So I would just love to hear your thoughts, bring you in on the conversation. If you were to summarize your chapter in a few sentences, what would you say those key differences are between GA4 and its predecessor, Universal Analytics?
Sure. One of the biggest differences with GA4 is the way that a user is identified. In Universal Analytics, really the cookie was the primary identifier for a user. And in GA4, we now have the ability to use a blended identifier. Basically, GA4 is looking for the best identifier it has for a visitor. So if you are sending user IDs for a visitor, it will use that, and it'll use that to identify that user. If it doesn't have a user ID, it'll look for the next level of identification, which in this case is the user's Google login, if Google Signals is enabled for that property. And if neither of those is available, then as a default, it will use the cookie to identify that user. So that's fundamentally pretty different. And then that can really have a big difference in your volume of traffic, especially if you do send a lot of logged in traffic, logged in identifiers, your volume might drop, but that's not really a bad thing because we're just having a much better idea of the actual number of independent users that are accessing your website. And it gives you that ability to understand user behavior that are logging in from different devices. So that's definitely a huge benefit. Obviously, another big difference for people that have been following this for a while is that the product was released as with the name App plus Web. So it's built off the Firebase, analytics tracking, Google Analytics for Firebase, the app, the app building software. So that's really been designed for measuring apps. And so because of that, it's really, it lends itself really well for measuring both an app and a website with the same data model. And you're able to compare and contrast activities on your website and your app. And then finally, I would say model data is a huge difference, which we never had that before in Universal Analytics. And so, you've got this idea of modeled conversions that are built into the tool. And so what Google is doing there is that when they have some browsers that are limiting cookie lifespan, they're able to model that into their conversion data and give it a better idea of what campaigns are actually driving conversions.
Yeah. I do want to talk about the second item that you mentioned in more depth with apps for sure, because it was originally presented to the world as the App plus Web version of Google Analytics. But first, I want to go back to what you said about identifying users, because I'm curious to know, now that GA4 uses a different methodology, which is more robust than just a simple first-party cookie, how would somebody expect their data to look different if they've got Universal Analytics and GA4 running at the same time?
Yeah, you can definitely anticipate that your volume of users could go down. And that's just because if there is that better identifier, we're not solely reliant on the cookie, which might expire. Cookies don't last as long. So the same user might come back a week from now or 2 weeks from now and have a different even first party cookie. And that in Universal Analytics would look like two different users. And so in GA4, if there's that better identifier, either the logged in user or Google Signals to be able to identify that user, that volume would, it would be identifying the same person for a same user.
So you could say in many ways, like a fundamentally a better way of sort of identifying a user, which is a nice segue into what you had said about the app and web differences. GA4 introduces this concept of an event-driven data model, which is a new concept for a lot of analysts, especially those who have not worked with mobile applications before. So curious, could you explain what this is and why it's important to GA4?
Sure, yeah. And this is also one of the reasons why it does take a little bit more of a lift to migrate from Universal Analytics to GA4. You have to think about the way you're going to collect the data. And that idea, like you said, it evolved from app tracking, where sessions really didn't make as much sense on an app. It's not always easy to define what a session is. And apps just relied more heavily on the concept of all actions that a user is taking is tracked as an event. And then they're identified with the user. In Universal Analytics, we had flexibility with the type of tags we were sending. They were slightly different. So you could send a page view, or you could send, sometimes there was social tracking, timing, and then there was the events that we were used to in Universal Analytics that had these fields of category, action, label, that we were collecting a lot of different data along with that. In the event-based data model, it's very logical. There's an event, and then there are certain attributes that you want to collect along with that event, which when you're collecting them, they're called parameters, and they feed those custom dimensions that we're familiar with. But you really just have a very logical event, and then those attributes that you're collecting with an event. And like we said, if you structure your data collection on your app and your web the same way, you're able to do that compare and contrast across two different properties.
Nice, which is really important because previously we had separate property types for apps and couldn't roll that data up.
Right.
Okay. Last question I have is about the enterprise version of GA4, which is now called New Google Analytics 360. There's a lot of new features that are released with GA4, but there's also a lot of things that you previously had to pay for the enterprise version to get that are now available for free. And so I get the question a lot, what are the differences between GA4 and upgrading to the enterprise version? Why are customers choosing to upgrade when they're getting a lot of new features that they don't have to pay for anymore?
Sure. Well, one of those new features that you don't have to pay for anymore is that export to BigQuery. So that's something that a lot of people are really excited about, having access to BigQuery without being a paid customer. But there's definitely reasons why a lot of companies would choose to upgrade. One of them first is that the entry price point is pretty compelling. It's about less than half of the price point that 360 was with Universal Analytics. And so if you have a moderate amount of traffic, not huge traffic, but up to 25 million events per month, you do qualify for that entry pricing. There are a lot of reasons why you may find that you need to move to the paid version, which would be there's a lot more customizations available. And we talked about those parameters. You only have 50 parameters if you're in the free version, where that upgrades up to 125 event parameters in the paid version. Another big reason I find companies interested in the 360 version of GA4 is the longer time frame for data retention. The custom analysis data defaults to actually 2 months, unless you change the setting to 14 months when you're creating a free property, which that's a big change from Universal Analytics, when we didn't really ever lose access to our data. And the paid version, you're allowed to retain your data up to 5 years. So I do find that that's a big one. And then we talked about BigQuery, but you may run into limitations in your export under the free version. I think you can export up to 1 million hits per day if you're not paid, and then the paid version is into the billions.
Okay.
Export to BigQuery.
Right. And then once that data is in BigQuery, the sky's the limit with connecting it to other sources and analyzing it. So, okay. Awesome. Well, thank you, Elizabeth. I think that summarizes it nicely. Obviously, there's an enormous amount of small differences between GA4 and prior versions, but I think you really hit the big ones, and I appreciate it. Thanks for the time.
Okay, thank you.